In a world drowned in irrelevant information, clarity is power. The problem isn't a lack of facts, but not knowing what truly demands our attention. This century isn't short of voices, it simply lacks the ability to listen in the right places. Every day, people are barraged by notifications, breaking news, warnings, trends, predictions, and crises. Everything is presented as if it's vital, as if failing to follow immediately will leave us behind. But within this flood of information, a paradox emerges. The more people know, the harder it becomes to understand what's really happening. The central issue isn't isolated technology, politics, or economics, but the ability to navigate perception itself. As every story competes for attention, our brains gradually lose the capacity to distinguish between what's important and what's merely noise. Society's major decisions about freedom, justice, employment, belief are often made in a state of cognitive exhaustion, not profound understanding. People react faster than they think, share before they comprehend, and rage before they question. This text doesn't attempt to offer a complete map for the future. It starts from the present, from the very real confusion of our time. The feeling that old narratives are no longer adequate to explain the world, while new ones have yet to form. Systems that once provided a sense of stability are now shaking. Promises once taken for granted have become suspect, not because the world has suddenly turned evil, but because familiar mental frameworks are obsolete in the face of deeper, faster change. This is a story of human fragility when living within systems that exceed individual control. The decision of an invisible algorithm can impact livelihoods. A stream of fake news can destabilize collective trust. A technological shift can render an entire skill meaningless in just a few years. In this context, a feeling of insecurity isn't a sign of weakness, but a logical reaction to a reality not yet fully grasped. The alarming truth isn't that people know too little, but that they believe they understand enough, as false certainty replaces intellectual humility. Dialogue is stifled, and extreme choices become appealing. This text focuses on slowing down. Slowing down to observe, slowing down to question what seems obvious, slowing down to realize that not understanding is also a state that needs to be acknowledged. So the key question isn't what the future will be, but whether people still possess the capacity to focus, the courage to admit uncertainty, and the clarity to choose what truly matters in a world constantly screaming for attention. Every story of this era begins with a stumble. Not a physical fall, but the moment of realizing that what seemed solid was merely a thin layer of paint over a crumbling wall. For decades, people believed the world had chosen the right path: freedom, openness, the conviction that the future would continuously improve. Yet, when unexpected winds blew, that paint peeled away, revealing an uncomfortably simple truth. The narrative humanity clung to for so long could no longer sustain itself. A world once confident in its progress suddenly saw unexpected cracks. Political upheavals, thought to exist only at history's margins, moved to the center. And people realized that all predictions about the end of conflict were mere illusions. A sense of disillusionment spread like wildfire through a small town, not because it was so convincing, but because it resonated with long-dormant anxieties. Every individual, every community, struggled to find a new story to lean on. But no single story was robust enough to encompass the entire chaos of this century. When there was no longer a common path, the masses reverted to their most primal instincts: fear, anger, and rejection of anything unfamiliar. And then, as notions of the future blurred, another wave crashed down, fiercer and colder: the rise of artificial intelligence and data. If political crises confused people, this technological wave stripped away their last anchor. In the past, people believed that when a new technology emerged, new jobs would replace the old, and the game would continue. This belief held true until machines became not only stronger than muscles, but also began to understand psychology, habits, and emotions. A great human error is to view our intuitions as something mystical and noble. But beneath every hunch are biological pathways, the subtle firing of neurons, old memories weaving into reflexes, all of which can be analyzed, predicted, simulated. When machines learn to read expressions as we read a familiar map, the gap between humans and algorithms narrows to a suffocating degree. The world of work, therefore, no longer resembles the familiar game between humans and machines. It's becoming a radical restructuring where jobs once considered secure from driving and financial consulting to medical analysis can all be replaced by tireless systems. There is no pride or sorrow in this process. It unfolds like a river forging a new path, silent and merciless, yet unstoppable. Many once comforted themselves that at least technology couldn't replace emotions, but advancements in neuroscience prove the opposite. Emotions are not magic, they are data, and data can be deciphered. A sufficiently sophisticated algorithm can glance into our eyes to know we're hesitating, hear the slight tremor in our voice to guess we're afraid, and combine millions of patterns from others to predict our next behavior more accurately than we understand ourselves. Facing this wave, humans can no longer rely on old promises. If a child asks what they'll do when they grow up, it's hard to answer with certainty. Professions once symbols of stability are now teetering. Skills passed down through generations are losing their value. The greatest threat isn't job loss, but loss of role in society. As new jobs emerge demanding capacities that most humans cannot keep up with, the most terrifying image isn't humans desperately confronting machines, but the moment when both coexist, yet humans fade like a flickering light bulb in a room filled with stronger illumination. The fear of obsolescence is no longer a distant prediction, but a constant hum in daily life. Amidst these upheavals, we cannot expect a single overarching narrative to guide us. Every ideology that once shone brightly is now faltering, and the promises of the last century slip through our fingers like sand. The most frightening truth isn't that technology is too powerful, but that humans are too easily disoriented when the old compass fails. As the shadow of technology stretches longer, people assume they at least retain one last stronghold: freedom of choice. Yet in their most confident moments, silent systems have slipped through the cracks, collecting every tiny trace each person leaves behind on a seemingly ordinary day. The terrifying part isn't being monitored, but being observed without ever realizing it. People still think freedom is a decision, a moment where they pause, deliberate, and choose. But when algorithms can measure heart rate changes from a fleeting image or detect slight vocal tremors to understand mood, that boundary thins like old paper. There are choices we believe are our own, but which were actually predicted before we even felt them. Freedom gradually slips away, not because it's stolen, but because it dissolves in silence. Imbalance also begins to grow in previously imperceptible ways. Power once rested in the hands of landowners, then asset holders, then factory owners. But this century witnesses a new form of power, invisible yet sharper: the power of data. Not everyone understands it, but those who control it are effortlessly beyond the reach of the majority. They don't need guns or armies. Streams of code analyzing collective behavior are enough to shape the future of an entire nation. When people say that those who own data will own the future, it's not a vague warning. For within these systems, every small action can become a piece of a larger, sharper picture ordinary people never see but are profoundly affected by. Inequality is no longer measured by assets, but by the ability to access and decode data, something the vast majority have never touched. Meanwhile, outside of air-conditioned server rooms and data centers, real human life becomes disjointed. While technology can conjure up surging digital spaces like an ocean, real humans still possess limited bodies that need touch, warmth, and presence. Yet, as relationships increasingly shift to invisible transmissions, a strange void appears: the gap between digital communities and communities of physical bodies. People can discuss online for hours, debating heatedly as if in a grand public square. But when they step outside, they feel a peculiar disconnect, as if physical and mental life are on two separate paths that no longer intersect. Politics, once based on the real needs of real people, suddenly feels adrift. Major decisions are made while people forget that behind every vote is a body that knows pain, fatigue, fear, and needs protection. This disconnect leads us to a global paradox. A single civilization is forming, yet the differences between people are deeper than ever. Airplanes, the internet, global commerce make everyone seem to live in a common space, but this doesn't mean they understand each other better. Shared values are diminishing, while distrust is growing on the surface. Everything looks like a unified system, but underneath are fractured underground currents. In such a world, it's not surprising that people gravitate towards old boundaries. They rediscover flags, identities, and national narratives, hoping they will be a refuge from the global storm. But the problems humanity faces are no longer confined within national borders. Climate, pandemics, artificial intelligence all exceed the control of individual nations. Nationalism cannot answer a global question, even if it offers a temporary sense of security. And while political narratives become increasingly difficult to decipher, religion also changes. It's no longer an independent lighthouse illuminating humanity, but gradually becomes part of the national machinery. Values once considered sacred are distorted to fit within borders. Divinity no longer guides humanity, but is conscripted to consolidate power. Ancient moral systems that functioned well in small societies are now powerless against new technologies where every decision can affect billions. Looking at these changes, we cannot deny a reality. Everything is happening faster than human capacity to adapt. New problems emerge while old answers remain incomplete. And in that chaos, humans still cling to the deepest desire, to belong somewhere, to some community, to some story. But to find that, they must confront a cold truth. True community cannot be built by algorithms, and true identity cannot be built by fear. In a world seemingly harmonized, a silent truth lies beneath every movement. All of humanity has entered a single civilization, but not in the way people dreamed. Identical cities, identical brands, voices about rights and technology echo everywhere. But this unity is merely an outer coat. Within, the memories, beliefs, pains, and pride of each community still stir, seeking opportunities to swell, collide, and sometimes tear at each other. From afar, we see a giant network: trade, travel, information. Technology connects every land like common blood vessels. But up close, we realize each of these vessels carries its own anxieties, its own stories that outsiders struggle to understand. People on opposite ends of a fiber optic cable can talk through a screen, but this doesn't mean they share the same inner world. Values considered universal are still interpreted differently, even contradictorily. Even within the same city, when surface unity cannot resolve deep-seated anxieties, people begin to retreat to old boundaries, flags, history. Identity becomes a point of anchorage when the global world becomes too vast, too chaotic. No one wants to drift aimlessly on a map without landmarks, so they redraw boundaries in their minds. Thus, nationalism arises not merely from ideology, but from the need for emotional survival. When insecure, people huddle together, like a body's natural reflex in the cold. But this huddling collides with another truth. The biggest problems of this century no longer lie within national borders. Climate, artificial intelligence, biological weapons, migration flows, economic instability all exceed the control of any single government. The problems have become global, but the human mind remains tribal. In this mismatch, cooperative efforts become fragile, while local calculations become dangerous. Here, a strange question gradually emerges. What happens when systems that once guided the human spirit begin to serve entirely worldly purposes? Religion was once a place where people confided their fears, hopes, and questions beyond comprehension. But in the modern world, many religions are drawn into the political vortex, becoming part of the power machinery. Sacred values no longer stand above worldly affairs, but are used to justify choices beneficial to this nation or that group. This doesn't mean religion loses its role, but it distorts its original function. Instead of guiding humanity to face new challenges like synthetic biology or artificial intelligence, religion gets entangled in traditional disputes that are no longer relevant in the current context. When ancient moral systems fail to keep pace with modern technology, humanity faces a dangerous void. They possess unprecedented power, but lack a moral narrative strong enough to guide its use. And amidst these tensions, the wave of migration becomes a test that fully exposes human nature. A person leaving their homeland doesn't just carry a few belongings. They carry a culture, a way of understanding the world, habits deeply ingrained. When they arrive in a new place, they don't just ask to live, they ask to be accepted. And those on the other side of the border face a difficult question: can we open our doors to others without losing ourselves? This tension isn't simply an economic matter, it's a story of identity. People fear that if they open up too much, the values they cherish will fade. And if they close off too tightly, they will betray the very ideals they once believed in. The truth is, every culture has strengths and weaknesses, values to learn from and values to reconsider. But to reach that perspective, people must overcome their most basic reflex, the fear of the unfamiliar. In every debate about immigration, beneath the numbers and reports are profoundly human stories. A family seeking refuge after war, a community fearing dilution, a child born between two worlds, unsure where they belong. And precisely in these stories, we see a clear paradox. The future of a shared civilization depends on humanity's ability to accept difference, while the fear of difference is the most ancient instinct. The actions we see today, closing borders, erecting new boundaries, igniting identity, debating cultural differences, are not signs of new divisions, but consequences of too rapid change. Humans are trying to protect what they understand, while the world constantly poses questions beyond their experience. And so, as the chaos of technology and politics still reverberates, another deeper, colder undertone spreads across the modern world, simmering yet sharper than anything else. The undertone of fear, not the primal human fear of wild beasts or darkness, but a more sophisticated kind of fear, nurtured by bright screens and endless scrolling text. We enter an era where terrorism is powerful not because of bombs and bullets, but because of its ability to warp human imagination. An attack might last only minutes, but its echoes persist for months, even years, in the collective mind. Material destruction is often so minor that other statistics easily surpass it. Deaths from traffic accidents, illness, pollution are many times higher. Yet we don't tremble when stepping onto the street, but we shudder upon hearing news of an explosion in a city thousands of miles away. Because in the script of terrorism, the main victims are not those who fall, but those who survive. Their fear becomes an extension of the attacker's power. It's hard to accept that a small group with limited resources can make a giant nation pivot its policies with just a few shocking acts. But the mechanism of this isn't brute force. It lies in how people react to uncertainty. When an attack occurs, we don't just grieve the loss, but also the feeling that the world has cracked in the place we thought was safest. The amplification of fear in each person's mind multiplies the attack's impact 100-fold, creating a feedback loop that the weak know how to exploit. When life is jolted by fear, people might imagine war will become a permanent specter, but the truth is more complex. Total conflicts, the kind of wars that defined past centuries, are becoming less frequent. This isn't because people are becoming more peaceful, but because they realize the cost of war far exceeds what any leader dares to bear. Yet, ironically, the real danger comes from moments of sheer folly. Not strategic calculation, but fleeting instances of overconfidence, misunderstanding, anger, and judgments made with insufficient information. We often imagine war stemming from grand conspiracies, intricate plans, tense meetings in closed rooms. But many historical catastrophes have arisen from impulsive decisions, from people who believed they knew better than everyone else. Folly, not malice, is the most dangerous driving force. It infiltrates every system, every individual, every confident idea that assumes it cannot be wrong. In a world equipped with modern weaponry and destructive technology, just one such moment is enough to overturn the fate of millions. The fragile sense of peace today is unlike the fear of the past. It doesn't roar, it doesn't threaten with the sound of marching armies. Instead, it exists as a crack in the structure of the collective mind. People know that large-scale war is less likely, yet they cannot extinguish the incidents that might arise from the ill-considered actions of an individual or a small group. This is the paradox this era must face. As the world becomes more interconnected, the consequences of folly become even more unpredictable. And as these fears still hang like a dark shadow over humanity, we enter another deeper layer of the story, the layer of self-awareness. If in previous eras, humans believed they were the center of creation, the pinnacle of history, the ultimate purpose of the universe, this century forces them to confront a harsh truth. The world does not revolve around humankind. What we consider destiny or mission is merely a product of collective imagination. Humility is not a moral recommendation, but a biological and cosmological truth. Just look at the night sky, where the light of stars began its journey before humanity ever appeared. We understand we are but a fleeting moment. Yet, instead of accepting this smallness, many communities attempt to construct grand narratives to comfort themselves. They depict humanity as the protagonist, the chosen one, the keyholder to all secrets. But these stories, however beautiful, cannot change the cold structure of reality. The universe doesn't care about us. Amidst this realization, the image of God that humans have carried for thousands of years is also laid bare, not to deny religion, but to expose how humans use divine names for very worldly purposes. We see sacred calls serving political ambitions, declarations made in the name of God meant to mask the fear of losing power. Humans do not follow divine will, they ascribe their own desires to divinity. When a group of people believes they grasp God's will, they suddenly feel entitled to judge everyone who thinks differently. This power is dangerous because it requires no proof, no reason, only sufficiently strong belief. And when this belief is combined with national power, it becomes a tool to impose, to divide, to escalate minor differences into major conflicts. This is the ground the 21st century must traverse, a world where religion is no longer an independent compass, but a mirror reflecting very human desires, illusions, fears, and the lust for power intermingling. Humanity faces a choice more difficult than any before. Build a system of values robust enough to confront the new era, yet self-aware enough not to fall into complacency. This opens the door to the next part of the journey, no longer just fear or illusion, but a fundamental question about truth. Having passed through the dense layers of fear and folly, we might think we can grasp the essence of humanity. But no, behind that lies an even deeper layer, thin as a blade yet sharp enough to cut through all illusions, the layer of humility. Not humility in words, but humility echoed back by reality, forcing humans to look directly at their limitations. Many generations have grown up with the story that humanity is the center of creation. It infiltrated culture, folk songs, prayers, the way parents spoke to their children. We were taught that life has meaning because we exist, that history is a straight upward path, that at its end, there will be a reward, enlightenment, or some grand destination. But looking at pure scientific data, looking at stars that died before human history was written, we understand that the universe did not cast us as the lead role. There was no cosmic council that sat down and chose humanity as the narrator. Nor is there a red thread connecting every event according to our wishes. It is all just the movement of fundamental forces, chemical reactions, probabilities accumulating over time. If we still try to find an absolute meaning, it is only because we want to fill the void in our own minds. And it is this lack of humility that has caused many civilizations to stumble when they believed their mission was special and infallible. When unwilling to confront their smallness, humans tend to erect a superior force, a supreme being, and attribute all their desires to that being. As if by lighting a sacred candle, they could illuminate the dark regions of history, or at least make themselves feel more secure. But when we scrutinize declarations made in the name of divinity, we see one thing clearly. Humans do not hear the voice of the divine. They only hear the echo of themselves in the deep cave of desire and fear. Conflicts, moral pronouncements, sacred charters all are sometimes just a backdrop for a game of power. When a community declares it knows the will of the Supreme Being, it can easily transform worldly desires into eternal commandments. They can divide the world into us and them, anointing themselves with righteousness and labeling their opponents as corrupt, with a divine shield in hand. They no longer need to question themselves. And this leads to the most dangerous weakness, the inability to self-interrogate. When people believe they possess absolute truth, every mistake becomes someone else's fault. Every pain is explained by betrayal. Every failure is interpreted as a divine test. No one bothers to look inward to see that their true motivations might be very worldly. Fear of losing power, fear of identity dissolving, fear of confronting the truth that they are not special. Against this backdrop, another ideology emerges, secularism. Many see it as a new compass, replacing old revelations. But secularism is not the pristine land many imagine. It is not a paradise of pure reason. Sometimes it carries a dark side very similar to what it criticizes, the complacency of believing oneself unbound by tradition or mythology. Some fall into the illusion that they transcend all other value systems, that they no longer need to examine themselves. But the core of the secular spirit does not lie in denying religion, but in loyalty to truth and compassion. Truth is the foundation, but not a cold, dry truth, rather a truth capable of alleviating suffering. If an action leads to harm, then no matter how sharp the reasoning, it cannot be considered right in the secular spirit. Reducing suffering, that is the guiding principle. To do that, secularism must turn the mirror on itself, recognize that reason also has its limits, that science can also be misunderstood, that human emotions cannot be discarded like waste. Only by looking into the darkness within oneself can a new value system avoid repeating the mistakes of old ones. We cannot progress by denying what has sustained humanity for thousands of years, nor can we progress by clinging tightly to tradition when the world has fundamentally changed. The only thing we can do is maintain a clear-minded state, not to worship any ideology as absolute, not to consider any story as the sole truth. As humans leave the dark corners of value systems, another wall appears directly ahead, so vast that many mistake it for the horizon. It is the wall of understanding, or more accurately, of what we think we understand. We often confidently believe that each of our decisions is the result of independent thought, that we clearly see the world around us. Yet, when confronted with the structure of modern society, we must accept an unpalatable truth. We know very little, often not enough to comprehend the systems we depend on. Today's world operates through complex networks: financial markets, global supply chains, technology, law, climate. Each network holds millions of variables, and no one can grasp them all. Even experts who dedicate their lives to studying these fields understand only a tiny fraction. Yet, in elections and major decisions, people are asked to voice opinions as if they understand the entire picture. This confidence doesn't stem from knowledge, but from an illusion of knowledge, the illusion that because we live in this world, we naturally understand it. When complexity overwhelms the mind's analytical capacity, humans turn to stories. Stories make the world easier to grasp. They give us a narrative thread to cling to. But stories also make it easy to mistakenly believe we've understood everything. And it is in these gaps between true understanding and imagined understanding that the greatest errors are formed. In this context, the demand for justice becomes more fragile than ever. Humanity's sense of fairness was born in small communities where everyone knew the origins and outcomes of every action. In a hunter-gatherer group, anyone could see who shared food, who was lazy, who caused trouble. Justice was direct, simple, based on observation. But the modern world operates through chains of interaction stretching across dozens of countries. The consequence of one action appears elsewhere. The cause of another problem starts with invisible links. How can that primal sense of justice keep pace with such a reality? When a product is manufactured in one country, consumed in another, and its environmental impact occurs in a third, who is responsible? When a decision in the financial system causes hardship for millions on another continent, is our instinct for justice sharp enough to adjudicate? The answer is often no. And when instinct cannot keep up with reality, people either give up or react with blind rage. This very powerlessness paves the way for a familiar phenomenon of this century: post-truth. Many believe post-truth is a new calamity brought on by social media, but looking deeper into history, we see that humanity has always lived with stories told according to the needs of the time: tribal myths, national symbols, religious legends. Many of them are more beautiful than the truth. Humans have always used belief to build solidarity, and to unite, they are willing to simplify, distort, and even create convenient truths. However, what makes this era different is the speed and precision of the tools. When data is weaponized, narratives can shift the perceptions of millions in a matter of hours. Lies can be optimized for specific target groups, tailored to their emotions and weaknesses. It's no longer a slow-spreading rumor from person to person, but a structure designed to exploit every loophole in the mind. Worse, people prefer to believe what aligns with their desires over what is true. Truth is inherently not very appealing. It is often complex, sometimes harsh. Meanwhile, stories finely tuned to fit each person's fears or hopes spread many times faster. That's why, in a data-saturated world, truth doesn't always win. The winner is the story that hits humanity's weak points. And as people try to envision the future in this context, they turn to one of imagination's oldest tools: stories about the future. But most of what we call science fiction doesn't really speak about the future. It speaks about the fear of losing control, the desire to transcend limits, the anxiety over changes to the body and identity. Science fiction reflects present-day humanity more than it predicts future humanity. In these stories, robots are often terrifying not because they are powerful, but because they are too human or too alien. Alien civilizations are often depicted as magnified mirrors of the society telling the story more autocratic, more free, more cruel, or more pure. Science fiction rarely accurately predicts technology, but it is excellent at predicting psychology. It reveals what humans fear, what they crave, and where they feel incomplete. Therefore, by observing how humanity tells stories about the future, we understand what they think about the present. The chaos of information, the ambiguity of justice, the shaking of value systems all are reflected in stories of eras yet to come. The future, in that sense, is not a destination but a mirror. The question is not what we will become, but who we are in this moment. And when humans have passed through the mists of fear, illusion, and precarious truth, they might think they understand enough to stand firm amidst a tumultuous century. But at that very moment, a more thorny question emerges. If the future changes shape every month, every year, what will humans cling to avoid being swept away? What foundation remains strong enough not to crack when the whole world constantly turns over? To answer, we must look back at what shaped generations: education of the past. Education functioned as a straight and steady path. Young people learned a trade and spent their lives practicing it. Knowledge was seen as a fixed treasure, learned once and stored away, to be used gradually, largely unchanging. The old world was slow enough for this model to work. But now, when algorithms change user behavior in just weeks, when machines can replace entire professions with a software update, that path has vanished. Everything that was once stable has become fluid as sand. And the most dangerous thing is that many still haven't recognized the landslide happening beneath their feet. The new world doesn't just change, it changes unpredictably. The dominant professions of the future don't even have names yet. Professions once considered irreplaceable are being coldly automated. Finance, healthcare, law, media fields that once required decades of experience are being disaggregated by machine learning systems as if humans were merely collections of behavioral patterns. Therefore, rote memorization of fixed knowledge is no longer meaningful. It's like teaching children to read a map of a city that's torn down and rebuilt every month. What humans need now isn't more facts, but the ability to learn continuously. The ability to learn from scratch without resentment, to change habits without fear, to dismantle old beliefs without shattering. This isn't inspirational advice, it's a condition for survival. If humans continue to cling to the idea that learning enough once will sustain them forever, they will become passengers asleep on a train hurtling into the night. But lifelong learning cannot be separated from flexible thinking. The new world demands minds that can pivot without breaking, that can temporarily doubt themselves to adapt to the context. Rigidity, once praised as steadfastness, now becomes a burden. The ability to transform, break free, and restructure thought becomes more important than grades or degrees. That's why, in many fields, the best performers are not those who know the most, but those who adapt the fastest. But learning and flexibility alone are not enough. To survive in a world besieged by technology and data, humans need to understand a deeper layer, understanding their own emotions. This text contains an important warning. When algorithmic systems become powerful enough, they will not only predict behavior, but also know how to exploit each person's fears, habits, and desires. If people do not understand their own biases and internal motivations, they will become wide-open doors to all external influences. Therefore, the most crucial part of future education is not in textbooks, but in observing the workings of the mind. If one does not understand how they think, they will be programmed without even knowing it. Many people believe they are free when making decisions, but in reality, those decisions have been shaped by a series of invisible stimuli. Advertisements that trigger loneliness, notifications designed to be addictive, personalized recommendations that lead them down familiar paths. Old education never taught how to resist these things. That is why humans must learn emotional intelligence, not control, not suppression, but the ability to recognize what is leading them. In an era where intelligent systems can read facial expressions, heart rate, concentration levels, and deliver content at just the right moment to steer behavior, humans are left with only one fragile shield: self-awareness. Furthermore, the new world also demands a type of competence that machines find hard to replace: the ability to collaborate. In this complex era, no one knows enough about an entire problem. Every great endeavor, from technology to medicine, is the result of dozens of connected minds. Therefore, education must help people learn to listen without imposing, to debate without attacking, to cooperate without losing their identity. As the world becomes more fragmented by data and algorithms, the ability to connect human to human becomes ever more valuable. Of all these things, the hardest yet most important is to understand oneself so as not to be hacked by algorithms. If intelligent systems know you better than you know yourself, knowing when you are vulnerable, prone to spending money, easily angered, then personal freedom becomes an illusion. Many live with a sense of autonomy, while their behavior is shaped by signals they don't recognize. This century's education must help people open their eyes to these mechanisms. When everything is put together, the picture becomes clear. Education is no longer a path of learning, working, and retiring. It is an open cycle where each person continuously learns, continuously works on themselves, continuously observes how they react to the world. Education is no longer baggage, it is breath. Humans have equipped themselves with lifelong learning, flexible thinking, and self-awareness so as not to be controlled by external systems. Another question arises, simmering yet heavier than all knowledge. Why do humans do all this? What purpose do they live for? What do they cling to find value in their lives? And as a natural reflex, most return to the most familiar things, stories from the time when they lived in small tribes. Humans told stories to understand the world when they couldn't explain the universe. They told stories about gods when they couldn't comprehend the chaos of human society. They told stories about destiny, nation, religion, mission. Humans tell stories not only to explain the world but to give themselves a place within it. They cannot bear to be just a tiny speck in an uncontrollable flow. They want a role. They want a story that makes their lives significant. Then, over time, these stories grew into grand narratives. Religion gave humans a role in the cosmos. Nation gave humans a role in history. Consumerism gave another role, the consumer, to express oneself. And so, many people live their entire lives as if they are following a straight path, where every event must have some meaning, every failure must serve a lesson, every choice must fit into a plot. But there is a truth that few dare to speak, even though it is right before their eyes. Life is not a story. It has no neat beginning, no orchestrated climax, no predictable ending. It is countless mixed moments. Streams of feelings appear and vanish, thoughts run by and fade, impulses that follow no logical sequence. If someone tries to edit their life into a coherent story, they are only discarding 99% of what actually happens. And it is the belief that one's life must have a coherent plot that becomes dangerous. When a person believes they are playing a special role, a warrior of faith, the chosen one, an inheritor of tradition, they will be willing to do things they never dared to do. They might sacrifice themselves, but worse, they might sacrifice others. They can justify violence if the story tells them that is the ultimate solution. Stories don't just provide meaning, they also grant permission for harm. And in this century, as grand narratives crack, as religion loses influence, as nations are questioned, as consumerism reveals its emptiness, many fall into a dangerous void. They don't know what to rely on. In that void, simple, extreme, easy-to-digest stories become powerful. They promise order, purpose, purity. They turn the lost into the chosen with a single rallying cry. But if we look deeply into lived experience, what people call meaning is not something that can be given to us in the form of a story. Meaning is not a gift bestowed from outside. It doesn't come from playing a script correctly. It also isn't something that needs to be found like buried treasure. Meaning emerges when humans stop and look directly at the moment unfolding, without trying to force it into any frame. When we no longer force our lives into the shape of a novel, we begin to see what we previously missed, the richness of presence. A misty morning is not the beginning of a new chapter. It is just a misty morning. A conversation doesn't need to become a milestone. It is just the intersection of two minds. A sadness is not a symbol of life's tragedy. It is just a stream of emotion that flows in and out. When humans allow experience to be itself, they begin to feel meaning without needing a story to guide them. That is why, in many parts of the text, the author constantly warns that when people believe too much in a story, they become easy to manipulate, because stories are easier to install than truth. Just change a few lines, a few symbols, a few images, and one can make a community follow an entirely new direction. But direct experience cannot be deceived. The feelings of pain, joy, fear, relief, that is the territory no story can change. And it is in that territory that humans can find a form of meaning more enduring than any narrative. So, in a world where grand narratives are collapsing and filled with toxic small stories, what can humans rely on to stand firm? The answer isn't out there, in promises or symbols. It lies within the very ability to turn inward and observe experience, to observe the mind. And that leads us to the final layer of this journey, meditation. Not as a religion, but as a skill to directly contact reality and oneself. When humans have dismantled the stories they once clung to for meaning, a strange silence emerges. In that silence, they realize a simple truth often overlooked. Every story, however beautiful, is a product of the mind. Life, however, happens at a deeper level, the level of sensations, thoughts, breath. To understand that level, humans cannot rely on theory, nor can they rely on belief. They have only one path, direct observation. That is why meditation becomes the final piece of this journey. Not a form of meditation sold as a miracle cure, not a mystical ritual, and certainly not an escape from the world. In the text, meditation is described for what it truly is, a mental technology. A technology that uses not machines, but human attention itself to explore the workings of the mind. And when truly practiced, people first realize that the mind is not the smooth flow they imagined. It is a continuous chain of sensations, constantly rising to the surface and sinking, mixed with memories, imagination, unconscious reactions. Meditation does not ask to stop them. Meditation asks to observe them appear and disappear without an anchor. The perceived solidity of the self turns out to be just a collection of fleeting fragments. In the early days, sitting still feels like confronting 7 wild beasts within oneself. Numb legs, aching back, fluctuating breath, the mind jumping from one image to another thought. But then, through each patient moment, people begin to see what they had never seen before. An uncomfortable sensation can be observed without immediately reacting. A stream of thought can be recognized without necessarily being believed. The gap between us and the initial reaction, that gap, is the root of freedom. Observation is not a passive attitude. It is the most powerful action a human can take in an era bombarded by information. When every system out there tries to snatch our attention, when every screen swipe is designed to pull us away from ourselves, sitting back and looking directly at the inner experience becomes a form of resistance. It is a refusal to be swept away by the world's strong currents. And then, from observation, humans see another truth. Emotions are not permanent. Anger, seemingly unbearable, dissolves in just a few minutes. Anxiety, thought to last forever, disappears when we shift our attention. Sorrow also has its own cycle. This doesn't make people emotionless. On the contrary, it helps them no longer be drowned by emotions, no longer fear them like enemies. But the greatest discovery is not in emotions, but in the understanding that thoughts are not commands. Many people live their entire lives believing they are what they think, but when observed closely, they see thoughts come and go like clouds. Some thoughts are light, some are heavy as stone, some repeat many times, yet they are still just products of external conditions. When thoughts are seen as mere phenomena, people are no longer easily manipulated by them. This is more important than ever in an era where AI can read behavior, predict choices, and even know when we are about to falter better than we do ourselves. When a platform knows the exact moment we are prone to scrolling, making a purchase, or clicking, our actions are no longer entirely our own. Without the ability to observe impulses before reacting, humans become reflex machines fed by data. Meditation does not prevent the world from assaulting our attention. Meditation only helps us see the arrow before it strikes, and sometimes, merely seeing the arrow makes it lose its power. The ability to observe oneself, in the true spirit of this text, is the last form of freedom a human can hold in this chaotic era. Reaching this conclusion, what remains is not a neat answer, nor a formula for survival in a turbulent century. What remains is a different perspective on the very state of confusion that humanity is experiencing. The greatest lesson isn't that the world is heading in the wrong direction, but that humans are still trying to use old maps to read a completely changed terrain. This century doesn't make people suffer from a lack of information. It makes them weary from constantly reacting. reacting to bad news, reacting to trends, reacting to the fear of being left behind. In that vortex, deep thought becomes a luxury, and silence to understand is seen as weakness. But here lies the paradox. Only by daring to pause can humans truly regain agency. Not political power, not economic power, but the power to direct their own attention. The entire content has led to a crucial lesson. The greatest danger of this era is not error, but blind certainty. When people believe they understand everything, they stop asking questions. When they stop asking questions, they are easily led by simple stories, strong emotions, and quick promises. Reality, meanwhile, is always complex, slow, and resistant to all intellectual shortcuts. The maturation of thought doesn't lie in holding strong stances, but in the ability to tolerate ambiguity without hastily fleeing from it. Another lesson, silent but deeper. Humanity is not living in a crisis of faith, but a crisis of meaning. Systems still operate, technology still advances, society still progresses. But the question, what is all this for, becomes increasingly difficult to answer. When there is no longer a common story strong enough to connect, each individual is forced to build their own internal compass, not to become special, but to avoid being dissolved. Therefore, the suggestion here is not to believe this or follow that faction. The only suggestion is to take your own capacity for thought seriously. Filter information like choosing food for your body. Identify emotions before sharing opinions. Dare to say, I don't understand enough, in a world that worships noisy self-confidence. This is not retreat, but a rare form of courage. And from this point, an unavoidable question needs to be posed to the listener. If all familiar stories are crumbling, what is truly guiding your daily life decisions? Understanding, fear, or inertia? Are you choosing what you believe, or are you just repeating what makes you least anxious? And deeper still, if you have to live in a world without ready-made answers, do you have enough patience to keep asking questions until the very end? If these reflections make you uncomfortable, confused, or force you to pause and think, then that is not a failure of the content, but perhaps a sign that a real conversation has just begun. This world is not short of speakers. It lacks those willing to listen, to think, and to question themselves.